A woman is dying in the snow. Two children are shaking beside her, and every single person on that frozen frontier chose to keep walking. Montana, 1891. A land that buries the weak without ceremony, without apology, without looking back. Then one man stopped. Not a wealthy man, not a powerful man. A cowboy with a failing ranch, a leaking barn, and barely enough money to survive the winter himself. He looked at those two forgotten children and said yes. The entire frontier called him a fool. They were wrong. Hit like, and drop your city in the comments. Let me see how far this story travels. The cold came early that year, not the kind of cold that bites and then forgives, the kind that settles into the bones of the land and decides to stay. By mid-November of 1891, the Montana Territory had already buried 3 men who'd underestimated it: a trapper caught between rivers, a homesteader whose fire went out in the night, and a young cattle driver who'd simply sat down in the snow to rest his legs and never stood back up. The frontier did not mourn. It moved on the way rivers move around stones. Not because the stone doesn't matter, but because the water has no choice. Ransom Cole understood that about this land. He'd lived here long enough to stop expecting mercy from it. He was 34 years old, though the lines carved into his face said otherwise. His hands were the hands of a man who had never once asked the earth for something it didn't take back twice. Calloused at every knuckle, split at the thumbs, permanently stained with the particular darkness of hard work and harder weather. He stood 6 feet and 2 inches in his boots, lean the way wire fences are lean. Not from lack of strength, but from having every unnecessary thing stripped away by years of use. He wore a duster the color of old charcoal, a hat that had been through 2 droughts and 1 flood, and an expression that most people in Harlan County had learned not to misread as unfriendliness. It wasn't unfriendliness. It was simply the face of a man who had very little left to waste. Not words, not warmth, and certainly not time. That Tuesday morning, he'd ridden 11 miles through frozen mud to Callaway's trading post because his coffee had run out 4 days ago, and he'd decided that if he had to face another sunrise without it, he might as well let one of those debt collectors go ahead and shoot him. He was tying his horse to the post outside when he heard the voice. It wasn't loud. That was the thing that stopped him. Loud voices on the frontier were common. Arguments over cattle lines, drunken boasting from the saloon 2 doors down, the occasional woman screaming for a doctor when a birth went wrong or a husband went worse. Ransom had learned to filter those sounds the way you learn to sleep through wind. But this voice was quiet, desperate in the way that quiet things are desperate, not because they've given up making noise, but because they no longer have the strength for it. He turned. On the steps of the trading post, half sheltered from the wind by a wooden overhang that did almost nothing against the cold, a woman sat with 2 children pressed against her sides. She was perhaps 30 years old, though she looked older than Ransom in the way that illness ages a person. Not through time, but through subtraction, taking and taking until only the essential shape of a person remains. Her coat was thin. Her lips were the wrong color. Her breathing, even from 10 feet away, had a sound to it, a wet, labored catch on the inhale that told Ransom everything he needed to know before she said a single word. The children were watching him. The boy was maybe 9 or 10, dark-haired, with eyes that had learned to assess threats before they learned to assess most other things. He sat slightly in front of his mother and his sister both, his small jaw set in a way that looked almost comical on a child's face until you realized it wasn't a pose. It was the real thing. Defiance stripped down to its purest form. The girl was younger, 6, perhaps 7. She had her mother's face. The same wide-set eyes, the same slight downward tilt to the corners of the mouth that might have looked sad on another child, but on her looked simply like someone who had learned very early that the world required careful watching. She was holding her mother's hand with both of hers, not like a child holds a hand, but like someone gripping a rope over open water. Ransom stood still for a moment, his hand on his horse's neck. Then the woman's eyes found him. "Sir," her voice barely carried. "Please." He could have walked inside. 14 other men had already done exactly that in the hour she'd been sitting there. Ransom would learn this later from Hob Calloway, who ran the trading post and had the particular gift of recording human failure with neither judgment nor surprise. 14 men, ranchers, drifters, a traveling preacher, Two deputies who really should have known better had walked past that woman and her children and chosen not to stop. Some had looked at her and looked away quickly, the way you look away from something that makes you feel guilty for looking. Some had not looked at all, which Ransom privately considered the worst of the two sins. The preacher had paused, pressed his lips together in what might have been prayer, or might have been the rehearsal of an excuse, and then continued inside. Ransom did not walk inside. He wasn't sure why exactly. He would think about it later in the particular way that solitary men think about things, not obsessively, but with a kind of quiet returning, like a tongue finding a sore tooth. The best answer he ever arrived at was this. The woman hadn't begged loudly enough to be ignored easily, and she hadn't begged quietly enough to be missed entirely. She'd hit some register in between that bypassed whatever it was in a man that usually let him keep walking. Or maybe it was the girl's hands, the way she held on. He walked to the steps and crouched down so his eyes were level with the woman's. "How long have you been out here?" he asked. "Since before light." A pause. The wet catch on the inhale. "We walked from Deacon's Creek." Deacon's Creek was 7 miles east. Ransom looked at her shoes, thin-soled, never meant for winter walking, and then looked at the children's shoes and felt something move through him that he didn't immediately have a name for. "What do you need?" he said. She looked at him for a long moment, as though she were measuring something. "My name is Eliza Mercer," she said. "My husband died 14 months ago. I have been ill since September." Another pause. She seemed to be deciding how honest to be, and then seemed to decide that she was past the point where anything but total honesty was useful. "I will not survive this winter." Ransom said nothing. The boy's eyes were fixed on him with an intensity that made the air between them feel charged. "I'm not asking for myself," Eliza said. "I gave that up weeks ago." She swallowed. "I'm asking for them." She looked at the boy. "Caleb." Then at the girl. "Rose." The names fell into the cold air and just stayed there. "I need someone to take them," Eliza said. "Both of them. Not to a parish, not to separate houses." Her voice had dropped to something just above a whisper, but every word was exact, deliberate. The words of a woman who had rehearsed them many times in the dark and was not going to waste a single one. Together. Someone who will keep them together and raise them as their own. A silence. The wind moved along the overhang and found the gaps in it. "Most people," Ransom said carefully, "would say that's a lot to ask a stranger." "I know what most people would say." There was no bitterness in it, only exhaustion. "I've heard it 14 times this morning." Inside the trading post, Ransom could hear the low murmur of men who had made their choice and were now warming themselves by Calloway's iron stove, probably drinking the very coffee he'd ridden 11 miles for. He could picture them perfectly without looking. The practiced nonchalance of men who have done something small and cowardly and are working hard not to think about it. He looked at Caleb. The boy looked back at him with those flat, assessing eyes and said nothing. His jaw was still set. He was, Ransom realized, prepared to be refused. He'd watched 13 other men refuse, and he'd assembled himself around it, built a wall of expectation so thick that disappointment couldn't penetrate it. He looked at Rose. Rose was still holding her mother's hand. She was not looking at Ransom. She was looking at her mother's face with the focused attention of someone trying to memorize every detail of something they know they are about to lose. Ransom stood up. He pushed his hat back slightly and looked out over the frozen road for a moment. Not because he needed to think, he would realize later, but because something in him needed a second to absorb the size of what he was about to say. Then he turned back. "My name's Ransom Cole," he said. "I've got a ranch out past the Whitmore Ridge. It's not much." A pause. "It's barely much at all, honestly. I've got a barn that leaks in 2 places and a south fence that needs rebuilding and about enough cash money to last me to February if I'm careful." He paused again as though he were giving himself one last chance to reconsider, and then something in his face settled. "But I've got room, and I've got enough for them to eat." Eliza stared at him. "Both of them," Ransom said. "I won't split them up." For a moment, nothing moved. The wind held still, the way wind occasionally and inexplicably does, as though even it wanted to hear what came next. And then Eliza Mercer, who had walked 7 miles in winter shoes with 2 children and a dying body because she had nowhere else to go, closed her eyes. A sound came out of her that was not quite a sob and not quite a breath. Something in between. "Why?" she asked. Just that. The word barely audible. Ransom was quiet for a moment. "I don't know," he said, "but I don't think that's what matters right now." He brought them inside. Hob Calloway, who had seen most things worth seeing in 30 years of running a trading post on the edge of the known world, looked up when Ransom came through the door with a sick woman and 2 children and said only, "Coffee's on the stove," which was, Ransom had always thought, one of the finest things about Hob Calloway. He got Eliza to a chair near the heat and got both children soup from the pot Hob kept simmering near the back, a perpetual, indefinable broth that was different every day depending on what needed using up, and that had probably, Ransom thought, kept more people alive than any doctor in the county. Rose drank hers immediately, silently, with both hands wrapped around the bowl and her eyes moving around the room with that careful watchfulness. Caleb held his bowl and did not drink it. "It's not poison," Ransom said. "I know it's not poison," Caleb said. His voice was a boy's voice, not yet cracked into manhood, but there was nothing boyish about the way he used it. "I'm not hungry." Ransom looked at the boy's face, the hollows under his eyes, the particular thinness around the jaw that only comes from a sustained shortage. "All right," Ransom said, and turned back to his coffee. A minute passed. Then Ransom heard the quiet sound of a bowl being lifted and soup being swallowed. He didn't turn around. He understood, without needing it explained, that Caleb needed to believe he'd decided on his own. He spent an hour with Eliza that afternoon, in the back room of Calloway's that Hob used as a storage space, an occasional infirmary. He sat across from her, elbows on his knees, and listened to everything she needed to say. He did not rush her. He did not offer reassurances he couldn't back up or comfort of the hollow variety. He just listened, which was perhaps the only real gift he had, and possibly, Eliza seemed to feel, the most valuable one she'd been offered in months. She told him about the ranch they'd had once, she and her husband Thomas, out in the flatlands east of the Harlan River. Good land, 40 acres of decent grass, a creek that ran clean through summer, and a house that Thomas had built with his own hands over the course of their first married winter. She told him about the 2 children, where Caleb had gotten his stubbornness from, Thomas, without question, and where Rose had gotten her silence from, herself, she admitted, with something approaching a smile. She told him that Thomas had died of a fever, not dramatically, not with any of the brutal frontier violence that made the stories people told, just a fever that got bad in August and didn't get better. And then one morning it was over. She'd been alone since then, managing as best she could, and then in September her own health had collapsed in a way she hadn't been able to stop. She did not tell him everything. He would understand this later, that there was something she held back, something specific and practical and important that she wasn't ready to release. He sensed the edge of it, the way you sense a fence line in the dark, not seeing it, but knowing it's there. At the end of the hour, she reached out and took his hand. Her grip was weaker than he expected, weaker than a woman her age should have had, weaker than someone who'd walked 7 miles through winter should have had left in her, like touching something that had already begun the process of becoming a memory. "If something happens," she began. "Nothing's going to happen today," Ransom said. A look passed across her face, not annoyance exactly, but the look of a person whose time is too short for comfortable fictions. "When something happens," she said, "there's a letter. Inside the lining of my coat, left side near the hem. It is for you." She paused. "Don't let Caleb read it. He's not ready." Ransom nodded slowly. "Don't lose those children," she said. Her eyes were level on his, entirely clear. "Whatever the winter does, whatever the money does, don't lose them." "I won't," Ransom said. He meant it the way men mean things when they're sitting in warm rooms in the middle of the afternoon and the consequences of their promises are still abstract. He had no idea yet what meaning it would cost him. He took them home that evening. The road from Calloway's to the Whitmore Ridge ran 12 miles through open country that offered nothing in the way of shelter from the wind and everything in the way of discomfort. Ransom had the wagon. He'd taken the horse and wagon that morning rather than just riding, some instinct he couldn't explain having told him to. And he packed the back of it with every blanket he had, which was 3, and got Eliza and both children settled under them. Caleb sat in the wagon bed facing backward, watching the trading post shrink into the distance with an expression Ransom couldn't read from his seat at the front. Rose fell asleep within 20 minutes, her head on her mother's shoulder, both of Eliza's hands wrapped around her small one. They were 3 miles from the ranch when Caleb spoke. "Why did you say yes?" Ransom kept his eyes on the road. "Already told your mother." "You told her you had room." A pause. "That's not why." Ransom was quiet for a moment. The horse's hooves were steady against the frozen ground, a rhythm like a clock that had no interest in hurrying. "No," he said finally, "it's not." "Then why?" Ransom thought about it, the way he thought about most things, straight through, without decoration. "Because she asked," he said, "and she meant it, and there wasn't anybody else." Silence from the wagon bed. "That's not a real reason," Caleb said. "Maybe not," Ransom said, but it's the one I've got." Another long silence. The wind moved across the flat and found the gaps in Ransom's duster. "I'm not going to call you father," Caleb said. Not aggressively, just clearly, in the tone of someone establishing facts before they get complicated. "I didn't ask you to," Ransom said. "Or sir." "That's fine. I'll call you Ransom." "That's my name." A pause. "Okay," Caleb said. It wasn't an acceptance. It wasn't even close to one. But it was the first thing Caleb had said to him that didn't have a wall behind it, and Ransom, who had lived alone for 6 years and understood the significance of small distances, noted it and said nothing more. The ranch looked worse at night. He'd known it would. Everything looks worse at night, especially things that are already marginal in daylight. But as he pulled the wagon up to the front of the house and held the lamp high, he saw it through their eyes for the first time and felt something uncomfortable move through him. The house was sound. That much was true. Thomas Mercer hadn't been the only man on the frontier who understood how to build something to last, and the 2 rooms and the kitchen Ransom had put together 7 years ago were solid, wind-tight, floored in good pine. But the yard was a study in accumulated neglect, the fence on the south side listing at an angle that was optimistic at best, the barn door held on by a hinge and a prayer, firewood stacked in a way that suggested urgency rather than planning. A working ranch in winter. That was what it was. Not a home. A working ranch in winter. He helped Eliza down from the wagon. She was trembling. From cold, from effort, from whatever was happening inside her body that she hadn't fully explained. He got her inside into the chair closest to the fireplace and had a fire going in 4 minutes, which was, he thought, possibly the most useful thing he'd done all year. Rose came in behind her mother and stood in the middle of the main room and looked at everything. The rough-hewn table, the iron stove, the shelf of books above the fireplace, the 2 windows with their heavy shutters, the braided rug that had once belonged to his mother and was now worn to its threads at the center, with an expression of such careful neutrality that Ransom found it almost painful to watch. Caleb came in last and stood in the doorway. "You can close the door," Ransom said. Caleb closed it. "There's a room at the back," Ransom said. "It's small, but there are 2 bunks in it. It's yours if you want it." A pause. "Both of you." Rose looked at Caleb. Caleb looked at the back hallway. "What's the other room?" Caleb asked. "Mine." "And the front room?" "Belongs to everyone." A moment passed. "All right," Caleb said. Rose went to her mother and touched her face, gently, checking. Then she walked down the back hallway toward the small room, and Ransom heard the sound of a door opening and the creak of one of the bunks as she sat down on it. Caleb watched his mother until she nodded almost imperceptibly. "Go," and then followed his sister. Ransom stood alone in his kitchen and listened to the fire and the wind outside and the settling sounds of a house that was trying to become something it hadn't been in a long time. Then he put on the coffee, because it was the only certain thing he knew how to offer, and he sat down, and he listened to the sound of 2 children settling into his life like stones dropping into still water. The ripples, he didn't know yet, would reach the edges of everything he had. In the room at the back of the ranch house, Rose Mercer lay in the lower bunk and listened to the unfamiliar sounds of an unfamiliar place. She was 7 years old, and she had not cried in 3 weeks. She had decided not to, the way children sometimes decide things with a completeness that adults rarely manage. She lay still and listened to her mother's breathing from the front room, counting the inhales the way she had learned to count them, making sure each one was followed by another. In the bunk above her, Caleb stared at the ceiling. He did not sleep. He was already planning what to do if Ransom Cole turned out to be wrong. The first morning came gray and indifferent, the way Montana mornings do in December. The sky a single flat color from one edge of the horizon to the other, offering light without warmth, visibility without comfort. Ransom was up before it. He was always up before it. He'd slept maybe 3 hours. Not from worry exactly. Worry implied uncertainty about what the problem was, and he was entirely certain about every problem currently sitting on his chest. But from the particular restlessness of a man whose life has shifted weight in the night and who can feel, even in sleep, that the balance is different than it was the day before. He built the fire up in the kitchen stove and put water on and went out to the barn to check the animals before the cold deepened any further. The 2 remaining cattle, he'd had 6 at the start of the year, and the summer drought had negotiated that number down mercilessly, were standing close together in the far stall in the way that animals stand when they are conserving heat and not especially hopeful about the near future. The horse was better, thick-coated and sturdy, though she watched him come in with an expression he'd always privately interpreted as mild reproach. His chickens, 7 of them, down from 11, were alive, which he counted as a daily victory. He stood in the barn doorway looking at what he had and did the math again. The same math he'd been doing since October, the same math that kept arriving at the same uncomfortable answer. The ranch was not failing in the dramatic way of men who gambled or drank or trusted the wrong people. It was failing in the quiet way of things that have been stretched slightly past their limit for slightly too long. A rope that doesn't snap but thins, fiber by fiber, until one ordinary morning it simply isn't there anymore. 2 more mouths, 2 more bodies needing heat and clothing and food through what promised to be the worst winter in a decade. He stood there long enough for the cold to find the back of his neck, and then he went inside to make coffee and face the day. Rose was already up. She was sitting at the kitchen table in the half-dark before the lamp was lit, her hands folded in her lap, watching the door as though she had been waiting for him to come back through it. She didn't flinch when he came in, which told him she'd heard him coming. He was already beginning to understand, a child who heard everything. "Morning," he said. "Morning," she said. Her voice was quiet and clear, like water over flat stone. He lit the lamp and hung it and began making the coffee, moving around his own kitchen with the efficient unconsciousness of long habit. After a moment, he heard the small sound of Rose's feet finding the floor, and then she was standing beside the stove, watching what he was doing. "You can sit down," he said. "I know," she said. She didn't sit down. He glanced at her sideways. She was watching the coffee pot with a focus that seemed disproportionate to the object, the way children sometimes fixate on small things because the large things are too large to look at directly. "Can I help?" she asked. The question was so carefully constructed, not "can I do something" or "what do you need," but the specific offer of help, already framed as his to accept or decline, that Ransom stopped and looked at her properly for the first time in the morning light. She was 7 years old, and she already knew how to make herself useful before anyone asked her to. She'd learned it the same place children always learn it, from watching what happened when they didn't. "There's a basket of eggs by the back door," he said. "Think you can crack 4 of them without getting shell in the pan?" A pause. Something moved across her face that might, in another child, in another life, have been the beginning of a smile. "Yes," she said. "Then I think you can help," he said. She went and got the basket. Eliza came out of this bedroom an hour later, moving carefully, one hand on the wall. Caleb was behind her, his expression the permanent alertness of a child who has taken on the work of watching, and Ransom understood without being told that this was the morning ritual. Caleb steady beside her, measuring each step, ready. Ransom pulled the chair closest to the fire out from the table without making a production of it, and Eliza settled into it and accepted the coffee he set in front of her with both hands wrapped around the mug, the same way Rose had held her soup bowl the day before. "You sleep?" he asked. "Some," she said, which meant no, or close to it. Caleb sat down across from him and ate his eggs with the systematic attention of someone who has been hungry enough that eating is never casual. Rose ate slowly, watching her mother between bites, that careful monitoring never quite switching off. The breakfast was quiet, not uncomfortable exactly, or not only uncomfortable. There was something else in it too, something that Ransom couldn't name, but that felt like the very early stages of something. Not trust, Too soon for trust. But perhaps the first condition of it, proximity. The simple fact of four people in a kitchen in the morning, sharing food and fire, and the particular silence of people who have not yet decided what they are to each other, but have agreed, at least, to be in the same room. It was, Ransom thought, a place to start. He put Caleb to work that first afternoon, not as punishment or even as strategy, but because the work needed doing, and because the boy was going to go quietly insane with nothing to occupy him. Ransom had recognized the type, had been the type, at 9 years old, all coiled energy and watchful suspicion, and he knew that idle hands and an untrusting mind made a combination that helped nobody. "South fence needs mending," he said. "Posts are sound, but 3 of the rails are split. I've got timber in the barn." Caleb looked at him. "I know how to fix a fence." "Good," Ransom said. "Then you won't need me to explain it." A beat. "Are you coming?" "In a while," Ransom said. "I've got the cattle to move to the lower pasture first." He watched the boy consider this, the possibility that it was a test or a trick, or the beginning of some adult imposition he hadn't yet identified. And then Caleb picked up his coat and went out to the barn for the timber without another word. Ransom moved the cattle and then went to the south fence and found Caleb already 2 rails deep into the repair, working with a focused competence that was startling in someone his age. Not perfect. The spacing was slightly off on the second rail, and he was holding the hammer too far down the handle, which was going to tire his arm faster than necessary. But fundamentally sound, the kind of work that got done. Ransom picked up a rail and worked alongside him without comment. They spent 2 hours at it, side by side, breath steaming in the cold air, the sound of hammering carrying flat and clear across the frozen field. About halfway through, Caleb said, without looking up, "Our fence at home was longer than this." Ransom set a nail. "What happened to your place?" A pause. "We lost it." Flat, factual, the way children describe enormous things when they've had time to process them. "After Papa died, Mama couldn't pay what they said we owed." "What did they say you owed?" Caleb drove a nail in 3 strokes, clean and accurate. "I don't know. Mama didn't tell me the numbers. She just said men came and told her the land wasn't ours anymore." He paused. "But it was ours. Papa built the house himself. I watched him." Ransom was quiet for a moment. "Did your mother ever talk about who those men were?" Caleb looked at him then, the first direct look he'd offered that wasn't adversarial. Something behind his eyes shifted slightly. Not opening exactly, but the beginning of a consideration. "No," he said. "She didn't like to talk about it." Ransom nodded and set another nail. "She's going to die, isn't she?" Caleb said. Not a question. Said the way a person says something they've been carrying alone for so long that the carrying has become the whole shape of the thing. And saying it out loud is less about seeking an answer than about setting down some fraction of the weight. Ransom held the rail in place and looked at the boy. He thought about the 14 men who had walked past Eliza on those steps. He thought about comfortable fictions and the cost of them. He thought about what it meant to respect someone, a child or anyone, enough to tell them the truth. "I think so," he said. "I'm sorry." Caleb looked back at the fence. "I know," he said, and drove the next nail. The neighbors came within the week. Not all of them, and not together, but in the way that news traveled on the frontier, quick and efficient as frost, following the roads and the fence lines and the social channels that connected the scattered ranches of Harlan County into something resembling a community, which it was, though community on the frontier had its own peculiar character. Generous and nosy in equal measure, suspicious of the unconventional, and deeply interested in the business of anyone who'd done something worth talking about. Ransom Cole taking in a dying woman's children was worth talking about. Gus Pemberton came first, nominally to return a borrowed post-hole digger, but actually because his wife had sent him to confirm what she'd heard from Hob Calloway's wife. He stood in Ransom's yard with the post-hole digger and looked at Caleb, who was carrying firewood, and then looked at Ransom with the expression of a man trying to formulate a diplomatic way to say something that wasn't entirely diplomatic. "Heard you took in some children," Gus said. "Word travels," Ransom said. "Harlan County's a small place." Gus shifted his weight. He was a broad man, good-natured in the way of people who have not been seriously tested, which Ransom did not hold against him. "Both of them?" "That's what I heard, both." "That's right." A pause. "Ransom, you barely have enough to—" He stopped himself. Reconsidered. It's a generous thing you did. Real generous. He said it the way people say generous when what they mean is inexplicable. I had room, Ransom said. Right. Gus nodded slowly. He looked at Caleb again, who had stopped and was looking back at him with those flat, assessing eyes, and Gus seemed to feel something about being assessed by a 9-year-old that made him slightly uncomfortable. Well, if you need anything, I know where you are, Ransom said. Gus left the post-hole digger and went. The others came in their own time, with their own variations of Gus Pemberton's particular combination of goodwill and bewilderment. Hank Orrin, who ran 300 head of cattle on the best land in the county and who had a quality Ransom privately thought of as the confidence of someone who had never gone without. He came with a side of bacon and the unsolicited opinion that Ransom should look into sending the children to the county orphan board in Billings, where they'd be properly looked after. Ransom thanked him for the bacon. Tom Aldridge, who was closer to a friend than most, came alone one evening and sat with Ransom on the porch in the cold and didn't say much, just sat there, which Ransom appreciated more than any of the others' words. It was Tom who finally said quietly, with no audience, "People are saying you've lost your mind." "People say lots of things," Ransom said. "I know it." Tom looked out over the dark field. "You doing all right?" "Honestly." A pause. "Ask me in February," Ransom said. Eliza lasted longer than he expected. She was stronger than she looked, or the warmth and regular food bought her time she wouldn't otherwise have had. Or perhaps she simply had things left to do, and her body understood this in whatever wordless way bodies understand such things. She spent the better part of December in the chair by the fire, reading to Rose from a slim volume of stories she'd carried in her coat pocket, which struck Ransom, when he thought about it, as the most deliberate act of motherhood he'd ever witnessed. A woman who'd walked 7 miles in winter with almost nothing keeping a book of stories in her coat because her daughter loved stories, because some things you carry regardless. She and Ransom talked in the evenings when the children were in bed. Not about the large things, mostly. Not about her illness, not about what would happen after. They talked the way people talk when they've bypassed the preliminaries out of necessity and arrived at a strange, compressed intimacy. About the land, about the years before Thomas died, about Caleb's habit of working through problems with his hands rather than his mouth, and Rose's extraordinary memory, her ability to recite back, word for word, anything she'd been told once and found worth keeping. She remembered the exact route we walked from Deacon's Creek, Eliza said one evening. Every turn. She told me which direction the wind came from at each one. A small pause. She's 7. She's paying attention, Ransom said. Always. Something crossed Eliza's face. Not quite a smile, not quite grief. I hope she learns to let some things go. Not everything deserves to be held that close. There was, Ransom noticed, something she kept not saying. He could feel the shape of it in the pauses, in the careful way she occasionally stopped mid-thought and redirected. He'd hold that letter she'd mentioned, still in the lining of her coat, where he'd left it. And he kept leaving it there because taking it felt like a thing he wasn't ready to do yet. Like taking it would be acknowledging something he was still trying to hold at arm's length. He was not a man who avoided hard truths, but he was a man who understood that some hard truths have their own timing, and the letter could wait until it absolutely could not. Caleb broke 3 weeks into January. Not dramatically, not in any way that announced itself. He simply came in from feeding the animals one morning and sat down at the table and put his face in his hands and didn't move. Rose was in the back room. Eliza was still sleeping. Ransom was at the stove. He turned when he heard the chair pull out. He looked at the boy for a moment. Then he poured a second cup of coffee and set it on the table near Caleb's elbow. Not in front of him, that would have been too pointed, too much of an acknowledgement, and sat down across from him and said nothing. The fire crackled. The wind moved along the walls outside, looking for entry. After a long time, Caleb lowered his hands. His eyes were dry. His jaw was set the way it always was. But there was something around the edges that was different from the first day. A fatigue behind the defiance, the beginning of the weight of a thing too heavy for a 9-year-old's shoulders. "She's worse," he said. I could hear her in the night. The coughing. Ransom didn't answer immediately. He wrapped both hands around his own cup and looked at the table. "Yeah," he said. "She's not getting better." "No." A pause. I keep thinking, Caleb said, and then stopped. He looked at the coffee cup he wasn't drinking. I keep thinking that if I just... He stopped again. The jaw worked. That if I do everything right, if I don't cause trouble, if I help enough, then maybe... He didn't finish it. He didn't need to. Ransom looked at the boy for a long, quiet moment. He thought about all the things it would be kind to say, and then he thought about what kindness actually required. Caleb, he said, there's nothing you can do to change what's happening to your mother. That's not because you aren't enough. It's because it was already happening before you had any say in it. He paused. The only thing you can do is be there. That's what she needs. Not you fixing it. Just you. Caleb stared at the table. I don't know how to just be there, he said, very quietly. I know, Ransom said. Most men don't, for a long time. He picked up his cup. But you've got time to learn it. A silence settled between them. Different from the silences of the past weeks, lighter by some small but measurable degree. Caleb finally picked up the coffee and took a drink and made a face, because he was 9 years old and coffee is terrible when you're 9 years old. And Ransom almost laughed, and didn't, but the almost of it was something. You're going to have to add about half a pound of sugar to that, Ransom said, before it's fit for human consumption. Caleb looked at the cup with the expression of someone betrayed by an object. Why do you drink it like this? Acquired taste, Ransom said. That's not a reason. Most reasons aren't when you look at them closely. January tightened. The debt collector came on a Thursday. A man named Fielding, who worked for a banking concern out of Helena and who wore a coat that was far too good for the roads he had to travel on, and an expression that suggested he was acutely aware of this. He stood in Ransom's yard and outlined, in precise and not unkind terms, the current situation with the note on the ranch, the amount outstanding, the interest accumulated, the timeline the bank was prepared to offer before it would be compelled to take further action. Ransom listened to all of it without interruption. I appreciate you coming out yourself, he said when Fielding was done. It's a significant amount, Fielding said with genuine apology in it. He was not a bad man, Ransom could see. Just a man whose job required him to visit other people's worst moments and account for them. I don't suppose you have resources you haven't mentioned. I don't suppose I do, Ransom said. Is there anything you're considering selling? The property itself. No, Ransom said. Simple and absolute, without anger. Just the word, like a wall. Fielding nodded slowly. He looked at the house, and Ransom knew he was calculating. The condition of the barn, the state of the south fence, the thin column of smoke from the chimney that indicated a fire burning carefully rather than generously. He was looking at a ranch running on the edge of its own survival. I'll go back to Helena and explain the situation, Fielding said at last. The bank will want to see some movement by April. You'll have it, Ransom said. He said it with a certainty he didn't entirely feel, because the other option was to let the uncertainty show, and uncertainty was a luxury he couldn't afford anyone seeing right now. Fielding left, his too-good coat disappearing around the bend of the road, and Ransom stood in the yard for a moment in the cold and looked at everything he had and did the math one more time, and it still didn't work, and he went inside and fed the children dinner and didn't say a word about it. That night, after the house was quiet, he sat at the kitchen table with a piece of paper and a pencil and tried every arrangement of his finances he could think of. Selling cattle. He had 2 left, and selling them meant nothing to drive or brand in spring. Selling the horse. Impossible. The horse was how the ranch worked. Taking on labor somewhere else, leaving the ranch unmanned through the worst of winter, which was both dangerous and practically incoherent. The pencil stopped moving. He sat there for a long time in the lamplight, alone with the numbers, and for the first time since he'd crouched down in front of Eliza Mercer on those trading post steps, he felt the specific weight of what it meant to have said yes with his mouth before his ledger had agreed. He was still sitting there when he heard the sound from the back room, small and quickly suppressed, but unmistakable. The sound of something being hidden. A rustling, then quiet. He stood and walked to the back hallway and looked in. Rose was in her bunk. Her eyes were closed. Her breathing was the careful, deliberate breathing of someone pretending to sleep. And in the strip of lamplight from the hall, he could see, just visible under the edge of her mattress, the corner of something. A folded cloth. He knew without looking what was inside it. Food, saved back from dinner. A piece of bread, probably. whatever she'd managed to slip away without anyone noticing. His chest did something it hadn't done in a long time. He stood there in the hallway for a moment, looking at this 7-year-old girl who had spent enough of her life uncertain about tomorrow that she saved food against it without thinking, the way other children saved rocks or buttons or pieces of string, just things that might matter, things that might be enough when enough was the whole question. He went back to the kitchen. He sat back down at the table. He looked at the numbers for a long time, and then he put the pencil down and made a different kind of decision. Not about money, not about the ranch, but about the thing that was actually worth protecting in all of this. The ranch could survive or it couldn't. Those 2 children were going to be all right. That he could control. He'd figure out the rest. Eliza called for him on a Sunday morning in the last week of January, when the cold outside had gone so deep that the air itself seemed to crack at the edges, and the cattle were pressing against the barn walls, and even the wind had quieted, as though it lacked the energy for its own violence. She was propped against the pillow, and her breathing was different, slower, more deliberate, each one a small act of determination. Her eyes were clear, which Ransom had come to understand was both the best thing and the hardest thing about this particular illness in its final stages. She was entirely present. She would be entirely present until she wasn't. "The letter," she said. He went to her coat, still hanging on the peg by the door where he'd put it the first night, and worked his fingers into the lining at the hem on the left side until he felt the folded paper. He brought it to her. She took it and held it for a moment, and something passed across her face. Not hesitation, but the recognition of an ending. The moment when a thing you've been carrying finally leaves your hands. "Not yet," she said. "When it's time." She gave it back to him. "You'll know." "Eliza, I want to see them," she said. "Both of them, please." He went and got the children. Caleb came in with his jaw set and his hands at his sides, braced in the way he was always braced now. Armor he'd been wearing so long it had begun to feel like skin. Rose came in holding Caleb's hand, and she went directly to the bed and climbed up beside her mother without being invited, fitting herself against Eliza's side with the unconscious exactness of long habit, the way 2 things fit together that have always fit together. Caleb stood at the foot of the bed. Eliza looked at her son for a long time. "Come here," she said. He came. He sat on the edge of the mattress, and he didn't set his jaw and he didn't brace himself, and for one unguarded moment he was simply a boy sitting next to his mother, and the loss of the armor was almost harder to look at than the armor itself. Eliza put her hand against his face. "You are going to be furious at the world for a while," she said quietly. "That's all right. Be furious. Just don't let it be the only thing you are." Caleb's throat moved. "And you," she said, turning to Rose, "are going to remember everything. Every single thing." Her voice was very soft. "Be careful what you hold on to, sweetheart. Some things deserve to be let go." Rose pressed her face against her mother's shoulder. Ransom stood in the doorway with his hat in his hands, watching the 3 of them in the winter morning light, and he stayed there because he understood that some rooms should not be entered, only witnessed from the edge. He stood there, and he held the letter in his pocket with 2 fingers, and he did not move until they were ready for him to move. The cold pressed against the windows. The fire breathed in the stove. The world outside continued its indifferent business, the way it always had, the way it always would. And inside, in the small warmth of a failing ranch on the edge of the Montana frontier, a family that had not existed 6 weeks ago held together against the dark. Eliza Mercer died on a Tuesday. It was the first Tuesday of February, 4 days after the morning Ransom had stood in the doorway, watching her say goodbye to her children, in the language that mothers use when words have run out, touch, and proximity, and the particular quality of attention that means I am memorizing you. She had lasted those 4 days with a stubbornness that seemed, to Ransom, less like the body's refusal and more like a deliberate act of will, as though she had things left to arrange in her mind before she could allow herself to stop. She went quietly, in the early hours before light, when the house was still and the fire had burned low and the only sound was the wind moving along the eaves in its slow, searching way. Ransom had been sleeping in the chair beside her. He'd taken to doing this in the last week, not because she'd asked, but because it seemed wrong to be too far. And he woke to a silence that was different from ordinary silence, deeper, more complete. He sat with her for a while before he woke the children. This was a decision he made consciously. to take those minutes alone before the morning changed irrevocably for everyone in the house. He sat in the chair beside the bed and looked at her face, which had released something in death that illness had kept taut for months. And he thought about a woman he had known for 6 weeks, which was both a very short time and, given the specific quality of those 6 weeks, not short at all. He had not loved her, not in the way that stories sometimes tried to arrange these things, but he had respected her in a way that felt, at that moment, like something larger than most of the feelings he could name. She had walked 7 miles in winter shoes with 2 children and a failing body because she refused to leave them without a future. That was not tragedy. That was something else, something that didn't have a clean word for it, but that sat in the chest and didn't move easily. He woke Caleb first. The boy came out of sleep fast, the way he always did, already assembled, already braced. He read Ransom's face in the lamplight, and he didn't ask. He just closed his eyes for a moment, very briefly, and then opened them. "Rose?" he said. "I'll wake her," Ransom said. "Do you want to be there?" A pause. Yes. Rose took it the way Ransom had expected she would. Not loudly, not with the theatrical grief of someone performing loss, but with a terrible stillness. She went to her mother's room and stood at the foot of the bed and looked and then reached out and touched her mother's hand and held it. And the expression on her face was something Ransom was not sure he would ever be able to fully describe, not even to himself. Caleb stood beside his sister. He put his hand on her shoulder. Neither of them said anything for a long time. Ransom stood in the doorway. The same doorway as before, the edge of a room he understood was not his to enter. And he held himself very still and let them have it. They buried her 2 days later on a piece of rising ground east of the ranch house, at the edge of the tree line where the pines offered shelter from the west wind, and the view out over the valley was, on clear days, the kind of view that made a person understand why someone might have chosen this land to begin with. Tom Aldridge came. Hob Calloway and his wife came. Miriam Calloway bringing food in the practical way of women who understand that grief requires feeding as much as it requires mourning. A handful of others. Not many, but enough. Ransom said a few words, because someone had to. And he was the one who had known her best, for all the briefness of it. He said she was a woman who had spent her last strength on something other than herself, which was rarer than people like to think. He said her children were well. He said the land she was buried on was good land, and that he would keep it so. Caleb stood straight through all of it, his jaw in its fixed position, his eyes dry. He had the look of a boy who had decided that the way to survive this was to be absolutely rigid, and Ransom knew that look well enough to know that the rigidity would crack eventually, and that when it did, it would be better if it happened somewhere private, and he would arrange that if he could. Rose held a pine cone she'd picked up at the edge of the tree line. She held it through the whole service and carried it back to the house with her and put it on the windowsill of the back room, and it stayed there after that, and nobody touched it. He read the letter that night. The children were asleep, or at least in their room, which was the agreement they'd arrived at without negotiating it. The tacit understanding that nighttime was when the house stopped requiring performance and everyone retreated to whatever private shape their grief was taking. Ransom sat at the kitchen table with the lamp and his cold coffee and Eliza's letter, and he unfolded it slowly, the way you open something you know is going to change the shape of things. Her handwriting was small and precise, the handwriting of a woman who had learned it carefully and used it sparingly. The letter was 3 pages, dense with the particular compression of someone who knew she didn't have unlimited paper or unlimited time. She began with the children, specific things, practical things, the kind of knowledge that only a mother carries and that dies with her if she doesn't pass it on. Caleb's nightmares, which came in waves and which responded best to being left alone rather than approached. Rose's tendency to go silent when overwhelmed, which was not absence but processing, and which required patience rather than intrusion. The scar on Caleb's left forearm, which looked alarming and was from a fence wire when he was 6 and had fully healed. Then she turned to the thing she had held back. Ransom read it twice. Then he set it down and sat very still for a moment, the way a man sits when something has just rearranged the furniture inside him. The land she and Thomas had owned, the 40 acres on the Harlan River flatlands, the house Thomas had built, the creek that ran clean through summer, had not been lost to debt. Not legitimately. Thomas had held a clear title, paid in full, registered in the county records at Harlan City. What had happened, Eliza wrote, in the careful handwriting of someone who had spent months reconstructing it from memory and fragments, and the few papers she'd managed to keep, was something different. Two men. She named them, Harlan Druce, who owned the largest land brokerage in the territory, and a man named Corwin Pell, who worked as a clerk at the county records office in Harlan City. Together, Eliza believed, and she laid out her reasoning with the methodical clarity of someone who had nothing left to lose by being precise. They had executed a scheme, a forged lien, filed against the Mercer property and the county records under a creditor name that didn't exist, for a debt that Thomas Mercer had never incurred. When Thomas died and Eliza had no money for a lawyer, they had moved quickly. Men had come to the property with paperwork that looked legal enough that Eliza, grieving and ill and alone, had not known how to dispute it. They had taken the land. Druce's brokerage had sold it within 3 months. She had learned this from a man in Deacon's Creek who'd seen the listing, for $400. Druce had kept the money. The documents proving the original title still existed, Eliza wrote. She had seen Thomas file them herself, stood beside him at the county records window. They were registered, which meant that somewhere in the records of Harlan County, unless Pell had managed to destroy them, which was possible but not certain, the evidence of what had been done was still there. She did not ask Ransom to do anything about it. The letter was careful about that. She wrote only, "I am telling you this so that if an opportunity ever came, you would know. I am not asking you to fight a battle that isn't yours. I know what I'm already asking." And then, in the last paragraph, in slightly less steady handwriting, as though she'd written it last and quickly, "But those were my children's 40 acres, and Harlan Druce is not a man who stopped with us." Ransom set the letter down on the table. He looked at the lamp flame for a long time. He thought about Caleb saying men came and told her the land wasn't ours anymore, with the flat factual tone of a child describing an enormity. He thought about Rose's pine cone on the windowsill, and the food saved under the mattress, and the 7 miles in winter shoes. He thought about Harlan Druce, whom he knew by reputation, a large, prosperous, well-connected man who moved through Harlan County with the ease of someone whose position had never been seriously questioned. And he thought about what it would mean to question it. He folded the letter and put it in the inside pocket of his vest, against his chest, and he sat there until the lamp burned low. Then he went to bed because the morning still required feeding cattle, regardless of what the night contained. February moved into March, and the cold began almost imperceptibly to consider retreat. The days lengthened by minutes that felt, after the compressed darkness of deep winter, almost extravagant. The cattle ate more, which meant they were building strength, which meant spring was somewhere ahead, even if it wasn't visible yet. Ransom worked the ranch with the methodical persistence that had always been his primary resource, and the children worked it with him, Caleb increasingly capable, his fence-mending competence expanding into the wider work of the ranch, with the speed of a boy who absorbs physical knowledge faster than he absorbs most other kinds, and Rose finding her place in the domestic machinery of the household with the same careful efficiency she brought to everything she did. The dynamic between Ransom and Caleb had shifted in the weeks since Eliza's death, not dramatically, but perceptibly. The way ice shifts before it breaks, small adjustments in internal pressure that don't show on the surface but change the fundamental character of the thing. Caleb still didn't call him anything, which Ransom had come to find almost endearing in its stubbornness. He simply began sentences without address, which worked well enough. But the wall had thinned, not dissolved. It would take much longer than a winter to dissolve something built as carefully as that, but thinned so that light came through in places. One afternoon in the 3rd week of February, while they were repairing the barn roof, the second of the 2 leak points having finally given up any pretense of structural integrity during a particularly aggressive sleet storm, Caleb stopped working and looked out over the ranch from the height of the barn roof with an expression Ransom hadn't seen on him before. "What are you going to do?" he said. Ransom was nailing a plank. "About the roof?" "About the money." Ransom drove the nail and reached for the next one. "Work it out." "That's not an answer." "It's the answer I've got right now." A pause. The wind moved across the roof, and both of them leaned slightly into it from long habit. "I heard what that man said," Caleb said. "The one in the good coat. I was in the barn." Ransom glanced at him. The boy's face was entirely level. He wasn't bringing it up to cause distress or to demonstrate that he'd been listening. He was bringing it up because he'd been carrying it, and he thought Ransom should know. "Fielding," Ransom said. "He said April." "He did. Do you have it? By April?" Ransom considered lying, in the way adults consider lying to children as a form of protection, and then remember that the children already know the truth and the lying is actually for the adult's benefit. "Not yet," he said. Caleb was quiet for a moment. "I could work somewhere else," he said. "In town, errands, or whatever they need. I'm strong enough." The simple directness of it, the 9-year-old offering his labor to save the house, landed somewhere in Ransom's chest and sat there. "You're staying here," Ransom said. "This is where you work." "But if the money—" "Caleb." Ransom stopped and looked at him fully, the way he'd learned to look at the boy when he needed him to actually hear something rather than just receive it. "I brought you here. That means I handle the money. That's not your weight." Caleb looked back at him with those eyes that were, Ransom had come to believe, older than any 9-year-old's eyes had a right to be. "You brought us here," he said. "That means it's ours too." Ransom held his gaze for a moment. Then he turned back to the plank. "Help me get this last section done before the light goes," he said. Caleb picked up his hammer. The storm came without adequate warning, which was the particular cruelty of the worst ones. There had been weather through the whole of winter. Of course there had. This was Montana in February moving into March. But the individual storms had arrived with enough atmospheric ceremony that a man paying attention could feel them coming. A certain quality of silence beforehand, a specific color at the horizon. The way the animals changed behavior 6 or 8 hours before the sky confirmed what they already knew. This storm arrived differently. It came out of the northwest late on a Thursday afternoon when the sky had been overcast but unremarkable all day, when the temperature had actually risen 2 or 3 degrees from the morning, when every indicator suggested a gray day ending in an unremarkable night. Ransom had ridden out that afternoon to check on the cattle in the far pasture. They'd been pushing against the northern fence for 2 days in a way that made him uneasy, and he'd wanted to look at the fence line before dark. He was 2.5 miles from the ranch house when the sky changed. It changed fast. That was the thing he would try to explain later and never quite manage, because the speed of it was outside the range of what reasonable expectation could prepare for. In the time it took him to register the shift in the horizon and begin turning his horse, the wind had gone from still to ferocious, and the temperature had dropped 15 degrees and the snow had started. Not the kind of snow that starts gradually, that gives you time to orient and plan. The kind that arrives at full force, as though it had been waiting around a corner. Within 10 minutes, visibility was down to the length of an arm. His horse, steady, experienced, not a young animal prone to panic, pressed her ears flat and moved with the stiff urgency of something that understood danger in its bones. Ransom bent low over her neck and let her have the reins to the degree that he trusted her instincts, which was a significant degree. He kept the wind on his left side, because he knew the ranch was south-southeast and the wind was coming from the northwest. And he kept moving and tried not to think about the fact that 2.5 miles in zero visibility was not the same thing as 2.5 miles under any other condition. He found the cattle huddled against a rock formation he recognized. The cluster of granite outcroppings the hands had always called the Bishop, for a reason lost to whatever hand had named them first. They were alive, bunched tight, already coated in snow. He pushed them south, using the horse and his body and his voice, moving them in the direction of the lower pasture shelter because leaving them in the open was not an option. Moving cattle in a blizzard in zero visibility is a particular kind of hell, and Ransom would not describe it in detail later because the detail of it was not the point. The point was that it took 2 hours, and when he finally got the animals under shelter and turned back toward the ranch house, he realized he had no clear sense of exactly where he was. He had the wind, he had the horse, he had the particular stubbornness that had kept him on this land through 2 droughts and 1 flood, and several individual catastrophes that might have leveled a man with fewer resources of pure persistence. He rode south and slightly east, and tried to believe these things were enough. 40 minutes later, the horse stumbled on a hidden drop in the frozen ground. A small wash, invisible under the snow, the kind of thing you could step around on a clear day without thinking, and went down hard, and Ransom came off her sideways and hit the frozen ground with the full weight of a man who has ridden horses long enough to know how to fall, and still hit hard enough that his vision went white for several seconds. He lay there for a moment, face against the snow, the blizzard pressing down on him with its entire indifferent weight. The horse was up. He could hear her moving, the sound of her snorting against the wind. She hadn't broken anything. He could tell from the sound of her movement, the way she distributed weight. Good. That was good. He tried to stand and discovered that his right ankle was not going to cooperate. Not broken. He probed it with his fingers through the boot and decided, with the pragmatic medical assessment of a frontierman who had broken 2 ribs and a finger over the years and had a reliable baseline for comparison. Not broken. Badly sprained. Which was better than broken and still meant weight-bearing was somewhere between difficult and not happening. He got back onto the horse from the ground in the blizzard, which was an exercise in determination and ignominy in roughly equal measure, and got her moving again south and east. But he was slower now, and colder, and the visibility was, if anything, worse. Back at the ranch house, Rose knew something was wrong. She knew it the way she knew most things, not through information, but through attention, through the accumulation of small details that other people's minds filtered out and hers kept. Ransom had ridden out at 2 in the afternoon and said he'd be back before dark. Dark had come an hour ago. The storm had come 40 minutes after that. And even in the house, with the shutters closed and the fire going, the sound of it was like something alive and angry pressing on every wall simultaneously. She had not said anything for the first half hour. She had kept the fire stoked and heated soup and watched Caleb, who was sitting at the table with his back very straight, not reading the book he had open in front of him. "He's not back," she said. "I know," Caleb said. A silence. "He rode out to the north pasture," Caleb said. "I know," Rose said. They looked at each other across the table. Rose was 7 years old and Caleb was 9, and the storm was doing what it was doing outside, and neither of them said the word that was in both of their minds, the word that had too much of the past winter in it to be said out loud without everything it meant coming with it. Caleb stood up. "I'm going after him," he said. Rose looked at him. "The storm. He went out to the north pasture," Caleb said with the focused certainty of someone who has already decided and is now simply informing. "The cattle were at the north fence. He'd have pushed them toward the bishop and then come back south. If he's not back—" He stopped, recalculated. "He needs help." "Caleb?" Rose's voice was very quiet. "It's a blizzard." "I know what it is." He was already moving. Coat, hat, the extra wool scarf that Miriam Calloway had brought with the food after the burial, the one Ransom had made him keep, even though he'd tried to give it back. He moved through the house with the contained efficiency of a boy who had made up his mind about something and was not interested in the argument against it. Rose stood in the middle of the kitchen. She was 7 years old and she had watched her mother walk 7 miles in winter shoes for love of them, and she knew exactly what that kind of decision looked like from the inside. She had her mother's eyes and her mother's way of watching things, and she watched her brother prepare to go out into a Montana blizzard at night to find a man who had given them a home, and she understood the shape of it completely. "The rope," she said. "Take the rope from the barn hook. Tie one end to the porch post. If you lose direction—" "I know," Caleb said. He looked at her for a moment. One of those looks that siblings exchange when something is happening that is too large for words, and words would only diminish it. "Keep the fire going. Keep the lamp in the window." "I will," she said. He went out into the storm. The cold hit him like a wall. He'd been cold before. Cold the way frontier children are cold. The ordinary sustained cold of a Montana winter. But this was different. This was cold with intention, cold that wanted something from him, that pressed on his face and his hands and the gap between his collar and his hat with a focused hostility. He put his head down and moved. He tied the rope to the porch post, as Rose had said, and played it out behind him as he went, feeling the coil in his left hand diminish with each step. The rope was 50 feet. He'd measured it in his head when he saw it hanging in the barn, which meant it would carry him to the barn and slightly past. Not far enough to do what needed doing. He tied it off at the barn post and went inside and found more rope hanging in the corner where Ransom kept the extra tack and livestock lines. He tied it to the end of the first and went back out. He had 100 feet of rope and a direction, and the stubbornness of a 9-year-old who had decided, in the particular absolute way of children who have learned that the world takes things, that it was not going to take this. He moved north, leaning into the wind, one hand playing out rope behind him. He couldn't see 10 feet in any direction. The ground was white and the air was white, and the difference between them was theoretical. He navigated by what he'd learned in 3 months of working this land every day. The slight rise to the east, the depression near the old fence line, the place where the ground changed character 30 yards north of the barn, going from the packed earth of the yard to the grass stubble of the pasture. Small things. The kind of things his mother had told him to remember, not knowing they would matter like this. He walked north and slightly east because the north pasture ran northeast, and because the storm wind was northwest, and because he had a 9-year-old's geometry and a cold that was working on his concentration with the relentless patience of something that had all the time in the world. He found the horse first. He almost walked into her, nearly had his face against her neck before he saw her, her dark shape materializing out of the white with the abruptness of something that hadn't existed and then did. She was standing still, not pulling away, and he grabbed her bridle and felt the relief of it go through him like a physical thing. Ransom was still on her. He was hunched forward, low over the horse's neck, his coat completely white with accumulated snow, moving with the mechanical determination of a man who is operating below the level of conscious decision and running on something older and more fundamental. He had the horse moving south, which was right, but moving slowly. And when Caleb grabbed the bridle and looked up at him, Ransom's face in the dark was the wrong color. "Ransom!" Caleb had to shout it to be heard over the storm. "Ransom, I've got a rope line. Back to the house." Ransom looked down at him. His eyes found focus slowly, like a lamp being turned up from its lowest setting. "Caleb?" His voice was rough and strange. "What are you? You shouldn't be out here." "I've got a rope," Caleb said again, louder, because this was not the moment for the conversation about whether he should be here. "Follow it back." "Can you ride?" "I can ride." A pause. "Ankle got thrown." "Can you ride?" "Yes." Firmer, the lamp turning up another notch, and "Then follow me." Caleb turned and found the rope line with his hand and started moving south, leading the horse, not looking back to see if they were following, because looking back would have required stopping, and stopping was not something he was prepared to do. The rope led him home, the way a rope through a dark house leads you to the door you need. Hand over hand, step by step, the wind trying its best and failing, because a 9-year-old with a rope line and a destination is not a thing that wind can argue with indefinitely. The lamplight in the window came up out of the white before he could see the house, a warm yellow glow that was the most precise and beautiful thing he had ever seen in his life. He followed it. He kept the rope in one hand and the horse's bridle in the other, and he followed the light, and he didn't stop until his boots hit the porch steps. Rose had the door open before he reached it. She looked at his face, and then at Ransom behind him, and then back at his face, and what crossed her expression in that moment, the specific quality of it, the relief that was so large it compressed itself into absolute stillness, was something Caleb would carry with him for the rest of his life, without ever finding the right words for it. He had found him. He had brought him back. That was the whole of it. Ransom came through the door under his own power, one hand on the frame, the bad ankle taking as little weight as possible. And Caleb caught him on the left side and bore some of it without being asked. And they made it to the chair by the fire, which was exactly where Rose was already standing, holding a blanket she'd had warming near the stove and a cup of something hot, because she was 7 years old and she had understood perfectly what was going to be needed. Ransom sat in the chair and let the heat begin its work, and looked at the 2 children standing in front of him. At Caleb, still coated in snow, his face red from the cold and his eyes burning with something that was not anger this time, but something fiercer than anger, something more like the look of a person who has just discovered something definitive about themselves. And Ransom opened his mouth and couldn't, for a moment, find what he needed to say. The fire crackled. The storm pressed against the windows. "You went out in that," Ransom said finally. Not a question. His voice was still rough, still coming back from wherever the cold had pushed it. "You didn't come back," Caleb said, like it was the simplest equation in the world. Ransom looked at the boy for a long time. He looked at the snow melting off his coat and the rope still tied around his left hand where he'd kept it on the way back in, keeping the line secure, not releasing it until the door was behind them. He reached out and put his hand on Caleb's shoulder. He didn't say anything. With some things, silence is the larger statement, and both of them knew it. Outside, the blizzard went on doing what blizzards do, enormous and careless and unaware of the specific human weight it had just failed to take. Inside, the fire burned and the soup heated and the lamp in the window kept its watch, and the three people in the ranch house that night were, in some way that none of them had words for yet, no longer the same combination of people they had been that morning. Something had been decided, not by anyone, not in any conversation, not written down or spoken aloud, but decided nonetheless, the way the most important things are decided, in action, in the dark, in the moment when a person finds out what they'll do, when everything is at stake and nobody is watching. The ankle kept Ransom off his feet for 4 days, which was 4 days longer than he was prepared to tolerate, and exactly as long as Caleb and Rose between them were prepared to allow. This was how he discovered that the two children, who had arrived at his ranch with nothing but the clothes they wore and the accumulated caution of people who had learned not to rely on anything they hadn't built themselves, had somewhere in the course of the winter developed opinions about how he should conduct himself. Strong ones. Caleb communicated his through the simple mechanism of removing Ransom's boots whenever he tried to stand up and putting them somewhere across the room, far enough away that getting to them required exactly the kind of weight-bearing the ankle couldn't take. Rose communicated hers by placing food in front of him with a timing and frequency that made it structurally difficult to argue about rest, because arguing required putting down the bowl, and putting down the bowl felt ungrateful. And Ransom Cole was not a man who managed ingratitude easily. He sat in the chair by the fire for 4 days and let them run the morning work, feeding the animals, checking the water troughs, the necessary small maintenance of keeping a ranch alive through the tail end of a brutal winter. And he watched them do it through the window and felt something he didn't examine too closely, because examining it would have required acknowledging how much had changed since November, and he wasn't ready to do that accounting yet. On the 3rd day, Tom Aldridge came by, having heard about the blizzard incident through the particular efficiency of Harlan County's informal information network. Hob Calloway's wife, most likely, who had a gift for knowing things before they were told to her. Tom sat across from Ransom with his hat on his knee and listened to the story, and then sat quietly for a moment. "The boy went out in that storm," Tom said. "He did," Ransom said. 9 years old. 9 years old. Tom turned his hat slowly in his hands. He was a man who thought before he spoke, which was one of the things Ransom had always valued about him. "Ransom," he said, "I've known you for 11 years. You are one of the most self-sufficient, least needing of anything men I have ever met in my life." A pause. "How are you doing with all of this?" Ransom looked at the fire for a moment. "I'm doing," he said. "That's not an answer. It's the best one I've got right now." Tom nodded slowly. He looked out the window at Caleb, who was crossing the yard with a feed bucket with the purposeful stride of someone who has a list and is working through it. "He's something, that boy." "He is," Ransom said. "And the girl?" "Rose." Ransom was quiet for a moment. "Rose is—" He stopped, tried again. "Rose is going to be fine. Rose has always been going to be fine. She just needed somewhere safe enough to show it." Tom watched him say this, and something in Tom's face shifted slightly. An expression Ransom didn't notice because he was looking at the window, but that Tom filed away as the most revealing thing Ransom Cole had said in 11 years of knowing him. On the 4th day, Ransom put his boots on himself while the children were in the barn, and stood up and tested the ankle carefully, and determined that it would hold if he was thoughtful about it, which was not the same as healed, but was the same as functional. And functional was what the situation required. He went to the kitchen table and got Eliza's letter from his vest pocket and read it again, because he had been reading it every day since he'd first opened it, and every reading revealed something new, not because the words changed, but because he changed, because the specific knowledge it contained had been working on him the way water works on stone, slowly and without apparent drama, until the shape is different. Harlan Druce, Corwin Pell. He'd asked Tom about Druce on the 2nd day, casually, in the way you ask about someone when you don't want to reveal why you're asking. Tom had told him what most people in the territory knew. Druce ran the largest land brokerage operation between Helena and the Canadian border. He'd been doing it for 15 years. He was wealthy in the specific way that men become wealthy on the frontier, through a combination of genuine acumen, strategic positioning, and a flexible relationship with the line between what was legal and what was merely unprovable. He had connections to the territorial government, to several banking concerns, and to enough of the county infrastructure that challenging him was not a thing people had historically attempted with any success. Why? Tom had asked. Curious, Ransom had said. Tom had looked at him for a long moment with the expression of a man who has known someone for 11 years and can tell the difference between curious and something else entirely. He hadn't pushed, but the look had stayed in the room after he left. Ransom folded the letter and held it in his hands and thought about 40 acres on the Harlan River and a house a man had built himself and 2 children who had lost both in the same year and had arrived at his door with nothing. He thought about the food saved under the mattress and the pine cone on the windowsill and Caleb's rope in the blizzard and Rose standing at the door with the blanket she'd had warming at the stove. Then he thought about April and Fielding's coat and the number on the note at the Helena Bank. He sat there until the pieces assembled themselves into something he could see the whole shape of. Then he stood up, put on his coat, and went to the barn. I need to tell you something, he said. They were both there. Caleb mucking out the nearest stall, Rose refilling the water trough from the pump they'd thawed out after the blizzard. They both stopped and looked at him, and the quality of their attention was the specific quality of children who have learned that adults say I need to tell you something in 2 very different registers, and who have become expert at distinguishing between them before the next sentence arrives. He sat down on the hay bale near the barn door and let them come to him, which they did, Caleb leaning against the stall post with his arms crossed, Rose settling onto a smaller bale nearby with the self-contained stillness that was simply her natural posture in the world. I read your mother's letter, he said. He watched them both. The whole thing. Caleb's jaw tightened slightly. What did it say? It told me about your father's land, the 40 acres. He kept his voice level, informational, not performing the gravity of it. They deserved to receive information like adults, with all its weight intact. About the men who took it. A silence. Caleb's arms were still crossed, but something beneath the posture had changed. A kind of electrical attention, the look of someone receiving confirmation of something they'd always half known without being able to name it. It wasn't a real debt, he said. Not a question. No, Ransom said. It wasn't. I knew it, Caleb said very quietly. Not triumphant, just the sound of a thing long suspected finally arriving in the open air. I knew there was something wrong. Mama wouldn't tell me. She said it was complicated. It was complicated, Ransom said. Your mother was protecting you from something that she didn't know how to fight alone. And she was right that it was complicated. These aren't small men, Caleb. The man behind it, Druce, he's connected to most of the power in this territory. So what are you going to do? Caleb said. Ransom looked at him for a moment. I'm going to fight it, he said. The barn was quiet. Outside, the wind moved through the eaves with the gentled sound of a storm that had spent itself. Caleb looked at him with those eyes that had assessed every man who'd come near his family for the past year and a half. He looked for the duration of time required to determine whether Ransom was saying something he meant or something he was offering as comfort, and he seemed to arrive at his answer. How? He asked. Your mother believed the original title documents are still in the county records at Harlan City, Ransom said. If they are, if Pell didn't destroy them, then there's proof. A forged lien filed against a title that was never encumbered. That's fraud. That's a crime significant enough that even Druce's connections can't quietly make it disappear. He paused. But I need to find them before anyone who's watching has reason to move them. Rose, who had been silent throughout this, said, Mama kept copies. Both of them looked at her. She was watching Ransom with that careful, level gaze. She had papers in a tin box, inside the mattress of our old house. She sewed a seam back open and put them inside. A pause. She told me not to tell anyone unless it mattered. The silence that followed this was of a particular character, the silence of a room in which something that changes the shape of a situation has just been said. Rose, Ransom said carefully, do you know what was in those papers? A deed, she said. She called it the real deed, and some letters, from the bank that said they had no record of any debt against the property. She said it with the precise, unhurried clarity of someone reciting something memorized. She read them to me twice so I wouldn't forget. She said to remember the exact words. She paused. I remember them. Caleb was staring at his sister. "You never told me," he said. Rose looked at him with the expression she used when she found his occasional blindness to obvious things genuinely puzzling. "Mama said not to tell anyone," she said. "She didn't say except Caleb." He opened his mouth and closed it again. "The house," Ransom said. "Your family's house. Do you know who has the property now, after Druce's brokerage sold it?" "A man named Garrett," Caleb said slowly. "Someone in Deacon's Creek told Mama. A farmer from Nebraska who didn't know." He paused, and the complex moral arithmetic of a 9-year-old working out whether the new owner was culpable flickered across his face. He didn't know it was stolen. "No," Ransom said. "He likely didn't." He thought for a moment. "That's a separate problem. The first problem is proving the fraud itself." He looked at Rose. "The documents in the mattress, if they're still there." "We have to go get them," Rose said. Simple. Factual. Already thinking 3 steps ahead, which was simply how Rose operated. "It's not that simple," Ransom said. "The property belongs to someone else now. Walking onto it to retrieve something from inside the house is—" "It's our house," Caleb said. "Legally, right now, it isn't." He held up a hand before Caleb's jaw could fully set. I know what it is and what it isn't, and they're different things. But if we do this wrong, if Druce's people get word that someone is moving on this, those documents disappear and we lose the only proof we have." He looked at both of them. "We do it right, or we don't do it at all." A long pause. "So what's right?" Caleb said. "I need a lawyer," Ransom said. "A real one, not a county clerk who does deeds on the side. Someone from outside Harlan County who doesn't owe Druce anything." He stood up from the hay bale, testing the ankle, finding it acceptable. "And I need to talk to Hob Calloway, because Hob knows every person who's moved through this county for 30 years. And if there's a lawyer worth trusting within 2 days' ride, Hob Calloway will know his name." Hob Calloway did know his name. He knew it without hesitation, in the way that Hob knew useful information, not dramatically, not with any particular sense of its significance, just as a fact that existed in his inventory alongside the price of coffee and the best route to the southern passes in spring. "Daniel Marsh," Hobbs said, "out of Bozeman. He's a real one, studied back east, came out here about 5 years ago. He's handled a few land cases." He paused to weigh a measure of salt. "Won 2 of them." "Who'd he win them against?" Ransom said. "County assessors, both times. Fraudulent appraisals." Hobbs set the salt down and looked at Ransom with the steady brown eyes of a man who had long ago stopped being surprised by what people came to his counter to discuss. "This about those children?" Ransom said nothing. "Because Eliza Mercer came through here in November before she came to you," Hobbs said. "Bought a few things. We talked a little." He picked up the salt again. "She was a careful woman. Said careful things. But she was afraid of something more specific than just the winter." "Did she say what?" "No." Hobb looked at the scale. "But she had the look of someone who'd been pushed off their own land. I've seen it before. It's a particular look." He paused. "Marsh's office is on Main and Bozeman. He's there most Mondays and Tuesdays." Ransom thanked him and bought his coffee and went home. He rode to Bozeman the following Monday, a 2-day ride each way that left the children with Tom Aldridge's family. An arrangement that cost Ransom a pride he hadn't known he still had, asking for that kind of help, and that cost Caleb an amount of visible resistance that resolved itself only when Ransom said quietly, "I'm going because of your family's land. I'll be back in 4 days." Caleb had looked at him for a moment and then nodded, and that had been the end of the argument. Daniel Marsh was a compact man in his early 40s with the particular quality of attention that the best lawyers share with the best doctors. The ability to listen in a way that makes you feel the specific shape of your problem is being taken seriously rather than categorized. He sat behind his desk in a small, well-organized office on Main Street in Bozeman and read Eliza's letter twice, straight through, without interruption. Then he set it down and looked at Ransom. "Harlan Druce," he said. "You know him." "By reputation." Marsh picked up a pen and held it without using it, the way lawyers hold things when they're thinking. "He's been mentioned in 2 land cases I looked at and declined in the past 3 years. The paper trail in both was, let's say, discouragingly clean. Someone who knew what they were doing had managed it." "Corwin Pell," Ransom said. County records clerk in Harlan City. Marsh made a note. If this clerk modified or filed fraudulent documents, and if the originals still exist in the county record alongside the forgery, then you have a discrepancy that a court can examine. He looked up. But here's the difficulty. Druce's people will know the moment you file anything. The clerk's office is the first place anyone looking to suppress this would move. Which is why I need the documents from the mattress first, Ransom said. Marsh looked at him steadily. The property belongs to a third party. I know. Retrieving personal effects left in a structure that legally belongs to someone else, without their permission. I know, Ransom said again. That's why I'm talking to a lawyer. A pause. Marsh looked at the letter again, then at his notes. If we approach the current property owner honestly, explain the situation, explain that there are personal documents belonging to the minor children who were the previous owner's heirs, a decent man would permit access. He paused. If this Garrett is a decent man. From what I know, he didn't buy stolen land knowingly. Then there's a reasonable chance. Marsh set his pen down. I'll tell you what this is, Mr. Cole, in terms that you should hear clearly before you decide how far to take it. What you're describing, if it's provable, is a conspiracy to commit land fraud involving a county official, potentially multiple properties, and one of the most connected men in the territory. He let that sit for a moment. The people who've benefited from this arrangement will not receive it calmly. I know what kind of men they are, Ransom said. Do you know what kind of fight this will be? Ransom thought about Fielding's coat and the debt that ran to April. He thought about the ranch that was barely holding, the 2 cattle and the leaking barn, and the number that never quite worked no matter how he arranged it. He thought about the most logical thing a man in his position could do, which was to keep his head down and his problems manageable and let Harlan Druce's history stay Harlan Druce's history. Then he thought about Caleb's rope in the blizzard, about Rose's pine cone on the windowsill, about a woman who had walked 7 miles to make sure her children had a future. I know what kind of fight it is, he said. I just needed to know if you'd take it. Marsh looked at him for a long moment. He was the kind of man who made decisions carefully, which Ransom respected, and who committed to them fully once made, which he respected more. My fee, Marsh said, will be contingent on outcome. If we prevail, we discuss it then. He picked up the pen again. Now tell me everything, from the beginning, leave nothing out. Ransom told him everything. The ride back to Harlan County took 2 days, and Ransom spent most of it thinking with the particular clarity that long, solitary rides produce, the kind of thinking that doesn't happen at a desk or in a warm room, but only when there's nothing to look at, except the land and the sky and the slow movement of a horse beneath you. He thought about what Marsh had said. The people who've benefited from this arrangement will not receive it calmly, and he mapped it against what he knew of Druce, which was mostly reputation and observation, but reputation and observation had always been enough for Ransom to work from. Druce was a man who had operated for 15 years in the comfortable certainty that no one would or could effectively challenge him. Men like that didn't prepare for challenges because they didn't believe challenges were coming. That was the only advantage Ransom had, and he understood it precisely. He was moving before Druce knew he was moving. The visit to the Garrett farm happened on a Thursday, 8 days after Ransom returned from Bozeman. He went alone, deliberately, because taking Caleb would have made it emotionally complicated in ways that might interfere with the practicalities, and because there were things a 9-year-old shouldn't have to watch, the interior of the house his father had built now belonging to someone else being one of them. Emmett Garrett was a broad-shouldered Nebraska farmer in his late 30s who had bought the Mercer property through a land listing the previous spring and had spent the summer and fall trying to make the creek pasture productive. He was not, as Ransom had hoped, a bad man. He was a man who had been deceived by the same person who deceived everyone. And when Ransom stood in his yard and explained carefully and completely that the property had been fraudulently obtained from its previous owners and that a legal action was in progress, the expression on Garrett's face moved through several stages in quick succession: skepticism, calculation, and then something that looked like genuine distress. I paid a fair price for this land, Garrett said. A fair price. I have papers. I know you did, Ransom said. And those papers were generated by the same man who forged the papers that took it from the Mercers. You are not the one being accused of anything. A long silence. Garrett looked at the house Thomas Mercer had built, which Garrett had painted and repaired and was in the process of making his own, with the complicated expression of a man calculating a loss he hadn't anticipated. "What do you want from me?" he said. Not hostile, just the question. "There are documents belonging to the Mercer children inside the house," Ransom said. "Hidden in the mattress of the back bedroom. Personal papers that belong to them legally, regardless of the property question. I'm asking permission to retrieve them." Garrett looked at him for a long time. "You said Mercer children," he said. "Where are they?" "With me," Ransom said. "I'm raising them." Something moved through Garrett's face that Ransom couldn't fully read. Some intersection of guilt and sympathy and the specific discomfort of a man realizing that the transaction he'd thought was clean was built on someone else's grief. "Come on then," Garrett said, and walked toward the house. The documents were there. Ransom found the seam Eliza had re-sewn in the mattress, ticking of the back bedroom. Careful, small stitches. The work of someone who had done it quietly and quickly and with no confidence she'd ever be able to come back for them. Inside the cloth pouch she'd made, a deed. The original deed to 40 acres on the Harlan River, stamped with the county seal of Harlan County, dated 8 years prior, registered under the name Thomas William Mercer, free and clear of any encumbrance. 3 letters from the First Territorial Bank stating, in the formal language of banking correspondence, that no note or lien existed against the Mercer property in their records or the records of any affiliated institution. And one additional piece of paper that Ransom hadn't expected, a letter from a man named Archie Boone, a former employee of Druce's brokerage, written 18 months prior and addressed to Thomas Mercer personally. The letter was short and not entirely coherent, the writing of a man who was frightened and writing quickly. But its substance was this. Boone had witnessed Corwin Pell filing a document he knew to be fraudulent against the Mercer property at Druce's direction. He had written to warn Mercer. He did not know if Mercer had received it in time. Thomas Mercer had died 3 weeks after the letter was dated. Ransom stood in the back bedroom of the house Thomas Mercer had built with his own hands and held these documents and felt the weight of what they meant. Not just legally, not just strategically, but the full human weight of them. A man had died before he could use them. A woman had hidden them and walked 7 miles and begged a stranger to save her children. And the children were at Tom Aldridge's house right now, waiting for him to come back. He folded the documents carefully and put them inside his coat, against his chest, next to the letter. He turned to Emmett Garrett, who was standing in the doorway. "Thank you," Ransom said. Garrett looked at the mattress. "Those kids," he said. "How old?" 9 and 7. A silence. Garrett looked at the wall Thomas had built, with an expression that had moved past discomfort into something more like a reckoning. "You win your case," Garrett said slowly. "What happens to this property?" "That's for the court to determine," Ransom said honestly. "You paid money for it. You've made improvements. The law isn't simple on restitution questions." He paused. "But I'll tell you this. Those children aren't coming back here to live. Their home is with me now. Whatever the court decides about the land, that's separate." Garrett nodded slowly. He looked at the mattress one more time and then looked at Ransom. "Then I hope you win," he said. He brought the documents to Marsh the following Monday. Marsh read them with the careful attention of a man reading a legal argument, which is what they were, and then he set them down on his desk and was quiet for a moment that felt, to Ransom, longer than it probably was. "The Boone letter," Marsh said. "I know," Ransom said. "If Boone is still alive and can be found, he's a witness." Marsh tapped the letter. His testimony combined with these documents against the county record, the forged lien alongside the original deed, is not a weak case, Mr. Cole. A pause. "It is not a safe case either, but it is not weak." "Then we move forward," Ransom said. Marsh looked at him over the desk. "I want to be clear about one more thing," he said. "When we file, Druce will know within hours. Whatever you have at stake, the ranch, the children's welfare, your position in that county, you need to be prepared for a man who has been operating without opposition for 15 years to respond to opposition with everything he has." Ransom thought about April and Fielding's coat. He thought about the number on the note that didn't work no matter how he arranged it. He thought about the specific freedom of a man who has already lost nearly everything and therefore has very little left to lose except the things that actually matter. "Mr. Marsh," he said, The worst thing Harlan Druce can do to me is take the ranch, and the ranch was already in the process of being taken. He paused. What he can't do is take those two children, and that's the only thing I'm actually protecting. Marsh held his gaze for a moment, then he picked up his pen. Then let's begin, he said. The pen moved across the paper, and somewhere in the distance, in a large, well-appointed office in Harlan City, the man who had stolen 40 acres from a dead man's family and felt entirely safe doing it was going about his business with the comfortable certainty of someone who did not yet know that a solitary cowboy with a bad ankle, a lawyer from Bozeman, and 2 children's worth of determination had just decided that comfortable certainty was a thing he no longer deserved. The filing happened on a Wednesday morning in the 3rd week of March, and by Thursday afternoon, Harlan Druce knew about it. Ransom hadn't expected subtlety from a man who had operated without challenge for 15 years. What he hadn't fully anticipated was the specific speed of the response. The way a man with deep roots in the county's infrastructure could, within 36 hours of a legal filing, make the air in a place feel different, heavier. The way pressure changes before a storm, perceptible to anyone paying attention, even before anything visible has happened. The first sign was Fielding. He appeared at the ranch on Friday morning, 2 weeks ahead of the April deadline he'd established in January, and this time his coat seemed less like an affectation and more like armor. He stood in the yard with the expression of a man delivering a message he hadn't composed and wasn't entirely comfortable with. "The bank is accelerating the timeline on the note," he said. Ransom looked at him steadily. The agreement was April. Circumstances have changed. Fielding had the decency to look uncomfortable about this. "I'm sorry, Mr. Cole." "I am. But the bank has received—" "There have been questions raised about the collateral value of the property, and the board has decided—" "Questions raised by whom?" Ransom said. Fielding was quiet for a moment. In that moment, in the specific quality of his silence, Ransom had his answer. "You have 30 days, Fielding said. "I'm sorry." He left. Ransom stood in the yard and watched him go and felt the shape of what was happening settle around him like weather. Druce was not going to fight the legal case directly. Not yet. Not until he'd assessed its strength. He was going to apply pressure at the points where Ransom was already vulnerable and see how long it took for the ground to give. The second sign came the following week from 3 separate ranchers in the county who had, over the past winter, shown varying degrees of friendly interest in Ransom's situation. Each of them, within the span of 4 days, found reasons to withdraw from small informal arrangements that Ransom had been counting on for the spring. A shared fence repair agreement with Hank Orrin, a handshake deal with another neighbor about summer grazing rights, a conversation with a third man about buying one of his calves in April that suddenly became uncertain. Nothing dramatic. Nothing that could be pointed to. Just the slow withdrawal of the small cooperative fabric that made frontier life workable, thread by thread, until the cold air came through. Ransom told the children none of this. He continued the work of the ranch with the same methodical persistence he'd always brought to it, and he rode to Bozeman on a Tuesday to meet with Marsh, and he kept the 2 worlds separate because the children had carried enough. But Caleb noticed. Caleb noticed everything that Ransom thought he was keeping to himself, which was the thing about a boy who had spent his entire childhood reading the subtext of adult situations for survival signals. He said nothing for a week, watching, cataloging, assembling his assessment the way he assembled everything, quietly, thoroughly, with the patience of someone who understood that premature conclusions were more dangerous than the wait for certainty. He came to Ransom on a Sunday evening while Rose was reading by the fire, and he stood in the kitchen doorway and said, "He's coming after the ranch." Ransom looked at him. "I'm not a child," Caleb said. Not angrily, just the statement of a fact he needed acknowledged. Ransom was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "No, you're not. Tell me." So Ransom told him. The bank's accelerated timeline, the withdrawal of the neighbors, the shape of what Druce was doing and why. He told it plainly, without softening, because Caleb had earned the plainness and because Ransom was, at this point in the winter that had made them what they were to each other, constitutionally incapable of lying to this boy. Caleb listened to all of it without interrupting. "How long?" he said when Ransom was done. 30 days on the banknote. The legal case, Marsh thinks we go to hearing in 4 to 6 weeks, depending on the court calendar. So they're racing each other, Caleb said. Druce is trying to take the ranch before the case gets heard. Ransom looked at the boy. The specific quality of his mind, the directness of it, the inability to be distracted by irrelevancy, was something Ransom had stopped being surprised by and had started simply accepting as one of the fixed conditions of his life. "That's right," he said. Caleb thought for a moment. "Is there anything we can do about the bank?" "I've written to 3 cattlemen in Helena about a short-term loan," Ransom said, "against spring cattle sales." "Will they say yes?" "I don't know yet." Caleb was quiet. He looked at the table and then looked at Ransom with an expression that had moved past the layered defenses of the boy who had arrived in November and arrived somewhere simpler and more direct. "I don't care about the land," he said. "Our old land, I mean. I don't care if we get it back or not." He paused, and the next words came out with the difficulty of something that has been sitting in a person's chest for long enough that releasing it requires actual effort. "I care about this one." The kitchen was quiet. The fire in the stove breathed steadily. "So do I," Ransom said. Daniel Marsh found Archie Boone in the second week of April, which was either exactly in time or almost too late depending on how you measured it. Boone was living in a small settlement 40 miles west of Bozeman, working as a farrier, which was about as far from land brokerage as a person could get while still residing in the same territory. He was 51 years old, had the look of a man who had been frightened for a long time, and had organized his entire life around reducing the things that could frighten him further: the small settlement, the physical work, the deliberate distance from anything connected to the life he'd left. Marsh wrote to Ransom about the meeting in careful, precise language, the language of a lawyer reporting facts rather than interpreting them. But even through the formality, the weight of it was clear. Boone had seen what he'd written in the letter. He had seen Corwin Pell file the fraudulent lien with his own eyes, at Druce's specific instruction, against a property he knew carried a clear title. He had been paid to look away, and had taken the money and had been living with it for 2 years. He was prepared to testify. Marsh wrote, "He is afraid. This should be acknowledged and accounted for. He will need to be handled carefully between now and the hearing date, but he is prepared to tell the truth, and his testimony, combined with the documents you retrieved, will be the spine of this case. I believe we are ready." Ransom read this letter twice at the kitchen table, and then did something he hadn't done since the night he'd first read Eliza's words. He sat completely still for a full minute, not thinking, just absorbing. The way you absorb something that has been uncertain for a long time finally becoming solid. Then Rose appeared at his elbow with a cup of coffee and set it down without a word, in the way she had of knowing when something needed to be present without being announced. And Ransom looked at this 7-year-old girl with her mother's eyes, and her particular quality of paying attention to everything, and he felt the full length of the winter in his chest. Every cold morning, and every hard calculation, and every moment in which he had not been certain they would make it to the other side of this. And he drank the coffee and said nothing, and she sat down across from him and said nothing either, and that was enough. The hearing was set for the 14th of May. In the weeks between Marsh's letter and the hearing, the territory of Harlan County went through a particular kind of churning that Ransom had not anticipated and probably should have. He had understood that filing the case would make noise. He had not fully understood the specific acoustics of small territory noise, the way a legal challenge against the most connected man in the county reverberated not just through the courtrooms and the newspapers, but through every kitchen and porch and feed store counter in a 100-mile radius. The Harlan County Courier ran a piece in its 3rd week of April. The reporter was a young man named Percy Gillum, who had been at the paper 2 years and who possessed, beneath an appearance of cheerful incompetence, a genuine instinct for the story that mattered. He had gotten wind of the filing through the courthouse records and had done enough work to understand what it implied. And his piece, 3 columns on the front page, careful and factual and deeply uncomfortable for anyone connected to the brokerage business in the territory, was the first time most of Harlan County understood the scope of what was being alleged. Ransom read it at Calloway's on a Thursday morning and then looked at Hobb, who was watching him with the steady brown eyes of a man who had seen most things. "You knew this would get out," Hobb said. "I knew it would have to," Ransom said. "There'll be pushback." "There already is." Hobb was quiet for a moment. Then he reached under the counter and produced a folded piece of paper and slid it across. 14 men left this with me this week, he said. Said to give it to you when you came in. Ransom unfolded it. It was a list of names. 14 ranchers and townspeople of Harlan County, some of whom he knew well and some of whom he knew only by sight. At the top, in Hobbs' small, precise handwriting, "For whatever it's worth." Below the names, also in Hobbs' hand, "If the bank calls the note before the hearing, the men on this list will cover it. Between us, we've got enough." Ransom stood at the counter and looked at the list for a long time. He thought about 14 men who had walked past Eliza Mercer on those trading post steps in November. He thought about how the county had called him a fool. He thought about the specific way that people are sometimes wrong about the most important things, and then, when the truth becomes undeniable, find ways to be right that require less courage than the original moment would have. And he thought that this was perhaps an ungenerous way to receive an offer being made sincerely. "Tell them thank you," he said. His voice was not entirely level, and he didn't pretend it was. "You can tell them yourself," Hobbs said. "Most of them will be at the courthouse on the 14th. They were. The courtroom in Harlan City was a functional, undecorated room that smelled of pine resin and old paper, and the specific combination of tension and forced patience that accumulates in spaces where consequential things are decided. It held perhaps 60 people in its rows of wooden benches, and on the morning of the 14th of May, it held them all. Ransom sat at the plaintiff's table with Marsh on his left and tried to read the room without letting the room read him. He recognized most of the faces, the ranchers and townspeople who had come to watch, the reporter Gillum with his notebook already open, Tom Aldridge in the third row with his hat on his knee, Hob Calloway and Miriam near the back. Harlan Druce sat at the defendant's table across the aisle with 2 lawyers from Helena whom he'd brought in specifically for this, which was either a sign of confidence in his legal firepower or a sign of concern about his position, and Ransom had spent enough time reading men to believe it was the latter. Druce was a large man, florid and well-dressed, with the particular posture of someone who has never had to accommodate their physical presence to a room because rooms have always accommodated themselves to him. He did not look at Ransom. He looked at his lawyers and at the judge, and at the space above the proceedings with the composed expression of a man who has decided that the appropriate emotional register for this situation is mild inconvenience. Corwin Pell sat in the back of the courtroom, not at either table, just in the rows. A small, pale man who appeared to have shrunk since the last time anyone had seen him in a public setting, and who spent the morning looking at the floor with the focused attention of someone trying to become part of it. The children were not in the courtroom. Ransom had been firm about this. Not because he thought they couldn't handle it, which was a judgment he'd long since stopped making about either of them, but because some processes have a brutality to them that has nothing to do with the outcome, and he preferred the outcome to be the thing they remembered. They were at Tom Aldridge's house again, and Rose had given Ransom a single clear-eyed look before he left that morning that contained, in its 7-year-old precision, the complete instruction, "Come back with the right answer." He intended to. Marsh was a careful lawyer in the way that good lawyers are careful. Not cautious, not hedged, but methodical in the way of someone who understands that the most effective arguments are built like good fences, post by post, no gaps. He laid out the case in its logical sequence: the original deed, the county registration, the letters from the bank. The forged lien, filed in the county records 3 months after Thomas Mercer's death, under a creditor name that corresponded to no registered business entity in the territory. The timing of Druce's brokerage listing the property, 47 days after the fraudulent lien enabled its seizure. Then he called Archie Boone. Boone walked to the witness chair with the look of a man walking toward something he'd been dreading and had decided to do anyway, which was exactly what he was. He was a farrier from a small settlement 40 miles west of Bozeman, and he sat in the chair and looked at nothing in particular and answered Marsh's questions in the flat, measured voice of someone who has rehearsed the truth enough times that it has become simpler than the alternative. He had worked for Druce's brokerage as a records assistant. He had been present when Druce instructed Corwin Pell to prepare a lien document against the Mercer property. He had seen Pell file it. He had been paid 2 months' wages and told to forget what he'd seen. He had written to Thomas Mercer because his conscience had given him insufficient peace, but he had not come forward sooner because his fear had been larger than his conscience until now. He said all of this without drama, without embellishment, in the particular tone of a man telling the truth because he has finally run out of reasons not to. Druce's lawyers cross-examined him for 40 minutes, and they were skilled lawyers, and they found every weakness in his account that existed. The 2 years of silence, the money he'd taken, the absence of documentary evidence of his witnessing. They were not wrong that these things were weaknesses. But they were not enough, because the weaknesses in Boone's testimony were the weaknesses of a frightened man, and the evidence that didn't depend on Boone didn't have them. The forged lien spoke for itself. The original deed, the bank letters, the discrepancy in the county records, these were not matters of testimony. These were documents, and documents, as Marsh said in his closing with the quiet confidence of a man who has built something solid and knows it, do not forget what they witnessed and cannot be paid to stay quiet. The judge was a man named Arthur Kane, who had been on the territorial bench for 9 years, and who possessed, beneath a manner of studied neutrality, the particular intelligence of someone who has spent a career distinguishing between what is argued well and what is true. He listened to both sides with identical attention. He asked 3 questions, all of them precise, all of them directed at the documentary record rather than the testimony. He recessed for 2 hours. When he came back, the room had the specific quality of held breath. 60 people, and whatever they'd each brought into that courtroom sitting in collective suspension, waiting for the fulcrum moment. Judge Kane set his papers down and looked at the room over his reading glasses. "The court finds," he said, in the measured cadence of a man who is aware that his words are about to become part of a county's history, that the lien filed against the Mercer property in the county records of Harlan County on the 19th of September, 1890, is fraudulent in its origin, invalid in its application, and without legal force of any kind. The original deed held by Thomas William Mercer and subsequently by his estate is the controlling document and was at no point legitimately encumbered. He paused. The room did not move. The court further finds sufficient evidence of deliberate fraud to refer this matter to the territorial prosecutor for criminal proceedings against Harlan Druce and Corwin Pell. He looked over his glasses at the defense table. "Mr. Druce, this court has no jurisdiction to compel restitution in the criminal matter, but I will note for the record that the proceeds of the fraudulent sale of Mercer property constitute unjust enrichment of the most unambiguous variety, and any prosecutor worth his office will treat it accordingly." He set down his gavel. The room broke open. Ransom sat at the plaintiff's table and let the sound wash over him. The voices, the movement, Gillam's pen already flying across the notebook. Tom Aldridge somewhere behind him saying something that might have been his name. Marsh was shaking his hand and saying something about the criminal referral and next steps, and Ransom heard it and would remember it later. But at that specific moment, what he was doing was sitting very still and feeling the full weight of what had just happened. 40 acres, a house, a dead man's title, 2 children's inheritance stolen by men who had counted on there being no one to come after it. Across the aisle, Harlan Druce was no longer maintaining the composure of mild inconvenience. He was speaking in a low, rapid voice to his lawyers, and whatever remained of the posture that had made rooms accommodate themselves to him had contracted into something smaller and less certain. Corwin Pell had already left the courtroom. He had, Ransom would learn later, left Harlan City entirely, which was a form of confession that would not help him when the territorial prosecutor came looking. Ransom stood up. He told the children that evening, after dinner, with the same plainness he'd used all winter. No performance, no dramatic construction, just the facts in their correct order and their correct weight. Rose listened with her hands folded on the table and her eyes on his face. Caleb sat very still, in the way he sat still when something was too large for his body's usual restlessness. When Ransom finished, the kitchen was quiet for a moment. "It's over?" Caleb said, not quite believing it. "The civil part is over," Ransom said. "The criminal case will take longer, but yes, the fraud is exposed. The record is corrected. Your father's land was his, and the court has said so formally and publicly." Caleb looked at the table. Something was working in his face that Ransom had never seen there before. Not the defenses, not the jaw set bracing for impact, but something raw and unmanaged. The expression of a boy experiencing a large emotion he has no existing architecture for, because it is not grief and it is not anger, and he has had so little practice with anything else. "The land itself," Rose said quietly. "Mr. Garrett's farm." "That's a separate matter," Ransom said. "Marsh will work with the prosecutor on restitution. Garrett paid fair value in good faith. The court will have to determine what's owed to him and by whom. Druce has money. He'll pay it." A pause. But I told you both months ago that land is separate from your home. Your home is here. That doesn't change." Rose nodded slowly. She looked at the table for a moment, then looked at him directly. "You could have sold the ranch," she said, "when the bank called the note. You could have paid it and walked away." "I could have," Ransom said. "Why didn't you?" He looked at her, at this 7-year-old girl with her careful eyes and her pine cone on the windowsill and her absolute precision about everything that mattered. "Because you were here," he said. Simply. The same simplicity he'd offered Eliza on those trading post steps. Not a large explanation, just the true one. Rose held his gaze for a moment. Then she got up from her chair and came around the table and leaned against his side, the way she had leaned against her mother that first morning in Calloway's kitchen. Just the weight of her, steady and certain, not asking for anything, just present. Ransom put his arm around her shoulders and she stayed there, and the kitchen held the three of them in its quiet. Caleb looked up from the table. His eyes were dry, but just barely, and he was not hiding it, and that the not hiding, after a winter of hiding everything, was more than Ransom could have asked for. "The banknote," Caleb said. "The 30 days. Settled," Ransom said. "The 14 men on Hobbs' list covered it." A pause. "I'll pay them back come summer, when the cattle money comes in." Caleb was quiet for a moment. 14. 14? Ransom confirmed. Something that was almost in the right light, the beginning of something that would eventually become a smile, moved across the boy's face. "Last November," he said, 14 men walked past Mama on those steps." Ransom looked at him. "Different 14, Caleb said. "Or maybe some of the same ones." He paused. "People change their minds, I guess." "They do," Ransom said. "Sometimes they need more time than the moment allows. And sometimes they need to see what the right answer looks like before they can choose it." He looked at the boy. "You went out in a blizzard at night with a rope. That's not nothing, Caleb. People saw that. People remember things like that." Caleb said nothing, but the almost smile stayed. They visited Eliza's grave on a Saturday in late May, when the spring had finally committed itself in the way that Montana spring eventually commits. All the way, without qualification, the land suddenly and extravagantly alive after the long compression of winter. The grass on the rising ground east of the ranch house was green and thick, and the pines at the tree line were moving in a warm western wind that smelled of the particular freshness of a world that has been cold for a long time and is remembering warmth. Ransom brought wildflowers. Rose had picked them from the meadow near the south fence that morning, filling her arms with them without explanation, and she carried them to the gravesite and arranged them with the careful attention she brought to everything, and then stood back and looked at what she'd made. Caleb stood beside his sister. He had his hands in his pockets and his face to the wind, and Ransom stood slightly behind them both, giving them the space that the moment required. After a while, Caleb said quietly, to the headstone, to the air, to whoever or whatever he was addressing, "We're all right, Mama. We're okay." He said it with the flat certainty of a fact, not the comfort of a wish, because it was a fact. Ransom had come to understand that Caleb only ever said things he was certain of, and he was certain of this. Rose placed the last of the flowers and then turned around, and she looked at Ransom with those clear, deliberate eyes that had been watching the world carefully since before she could name most of what she saw. "Can we go home?" she said. The word landed in the warm spring air with its full weight. Home. Not the trading post, not the cramped room above a stranger's kitchen, not the house at Deacon's Creek with its week-to-week uncertainty and its mother counting her breaths, not any of the temporary shelters that the past year had required them to inhabit. This one. The one with the leaking barn that was now repaired, and the south fence that was now sound, and the pine cone on the windowsill, and the braided rug worn to threads at the center, and the coffee that was terrible until you added enough sugar to make it survivable. The one that was theirs. "Yeah," Ransom said. "Let's go home." They walked back through the green field in the May warmth, the three of them, with the wind off the western mountains moving through the grass the way wind moves through grass when a winter is finally, definitively over, with the ease of something that has all the space it needs and is simply passing through, gentle and unhurried, toward wherever it's going next. The ranch sat at the bottom of the slope, smoke rising from the kitchen chimney where Rose had left the stove burning, the barn door open, the south fence standing straight and solid in the morning light. A small place. A marginal place by the calculations of most reasonable men. A place that had come closer than it had any right to admit to not surviving the winter just past. But it had, and they had, and the specific nature of what they had survived together. The cold and the debt and the blizzard and the courtroom and every ordinary and extraordinary day in between had made something that none of them had words for yet, but that all three of them felt in exactly the same way, the way you feel things that don't need explaining because they are simply true. Harlan County would remember the court case. It would remember the exposure of Druce and the fall of Pell and the newspaper stories that Gillum wrote in the weeks that followed, the ones that got picked up by papers in Helena and then further east, the story of a small fraud that turned out to be not so small, the story of a territory that had allowed certain men too much comfort for too long. The county would tell that story for years. But the story that mattered, the one that didn't make the papers, the one that was too quiet and too particular for the broad strokes of public record, was this: a November morning, a trading post, a dying woman on the steps, and 14 men walking past her, and then one man who stopped. Not because he had more than the others. He had less. Not because he was more certain. He was the least certain man on that road. He stopped because she asked, and because she meant it, and because there was nobody else. That was it. That was the whole of the original choice, in all its unspectacular, uncalculated, unremarkable ordinariness. And from that one ordinary morning, through a winter that tried its level best to break everything it could reach, the shape of three lives had been changed in ways that none of them would ever fully be able to account for. Caleb Mercer, who had arrived with his jaw set against the world, would grow up to be a man who worked with his hands and his mind in equal measure, who had his mother's precision and his father's stubbornness, and something additionally his own. A quality of showing up in the hard moments that the people around him would come to rely on without fully understanding where it had come from, though he knew. He always knew. Rose Mercer, who remembered everything, would remember this year most of all. Not its grief, though she held that too, the way she held everything, carefully and without losing it. But its other quality, the one she had felt for the first time standing in a stranger's kitchen with her hands around a soup bowl, the quality of being somewhere that was not going to disappear. She would spend the rest of her life able to recognize that quality in places and people when she found it, and she would find it because she knew precisely what it felt like. And Ransom Cole, who had ridden 11 miles for coffee on a November morning and come home with 2 children and a promise he'd had no earthly reason to be confident he could keep, would stand in his yard on spring mornings for the rest of his life and watch the land he'd held on to and the children who had held on with him and feel, in the most uncomplicated and complete way available to a solitary man who had always been better at showing up than explaining himself, that he had done the thing that most needed doing. That it had cost him everything he could afford and some things he couldn't was simply the nature of it. That it had given back more than it cost was the part the frontier had not predicted. But the frontier was not always right about what a person could carry, and it was almost never right about what a person could become when the right choice was made at the right moment by someone who had just enough left in him to make it. The door of the ranch house opened. The smoke rose. The spring wind moved through the grass. A family went home.